You might remember that the call for paper invited contributions on how a vision of the protective state and public policy geared towards expanding freedoms at work appears to have yielded, that's the terms of the call for paper, to free market projects centered on market liberalization, retrenchment of social welfare, and the new public management. And I'll focus here on, based on work in project, prolegomenon, I would call in Latin. It's work on the consolidation of a neoliberal regime in the US post-79. So it's, instead of being international comparisons, it's historical comparisons across time periods, pre-79, post-79. Consolidation of a neoliberal regimes, its impact on labor relations in the public sector especially, and people's welfare, because some key programs are being attacked currently. My focus on the public sector is not that of someone that comes from a lot of empirical work on the shop floor or in education institutions or healthcare. I'm looking more at the construction of public policies, their contestation, and the effects of neoliberal policies on the rights of public workers in the US. I'm focusing on the public sector because, as Chris Owell has explained, states have become more preoccupied and interventionists in the regulation of class relations. And what we've seen the closing of the option of building a Wagner regime for the public sector, late 70s. The conservative movement has opposed this avenue, and then has opposed systematically the granting of more generous rights to bargain collectively or strike to public workers in the 70s. And the stagflation crisis of the 70s and early 80s was really a turning point. The Volcker shock, the turn to monetarism, the turn to austerity, privatization, deregulation, and even some concerns about the way government does business. All of this started under the Carter administration, late 70s, and was pushed forward after that under Reagan, of course, and there's quite a bit of overlap between our papers on what Reagan and Clinton did. So I'm trying to contrast these two periods, and there I'm building on a literature in international political economy and comparative political economy that stresses the importance of growth models or macroeconomic regimes or social structures of accumulation. That's not a new framework, but people like David Coates have been converging towards it lately. So these frameworks of analysis have the advantage to draw attention to the ensemble of ideas, yes, but also institutions, organizations, power relations, and the basis for economic interests. And how these are configured in specific forms of capitalism, but also specific time periods. So I'm contrasting the evolution between the conservative movement in particular, as it's been organized around the GOP, but other organizations, and how this conservative movement has been galvanized by public debt problems that have been growing since the late 70s, early 90s. So basically, there's three sections to the paper. One is more a broad context and historiography of the period between 73 and 79. It's really concentrating on the stagflation crisis of 73, 79. How in that context, public sector unions in the US, which were very much on the move, which were making great gains end of 60s, early 70s on the legislative plane, started to confront a more aggressive conservative movement. Upon which, later on, what we call neoliberal ideas, what intellectuals call neoliberal ideas, have been grafted on this long developing conservative movements. The conservative movement in the US dates from the 50s, 60s, really. and then back then had ideas of libertarianism attached to it, but it was secondary to ideas of law and order, anti-communism, anti-labor, anti-big state, etc. So I'm trying to look at neoliberal ideas, but how they've converged with a broader conservative movement over the years, and how this explains how deregulation, privatization, aligning state practices with private sector practices, all this became a series of talismans of the right, the new right, as Reagan was ascending politically. And of course, they've been applied after he took power at the turn of the 80s. So my work is building on another segment of political science literature. Acker and Pearson have documented how since the 70s, the US Chamber of Commerce, other peak business organizations have taken steps to attack the taxation structure, progressive taxation structure in the US, and regulations on business. I'm more interested, I build on the work they do on organization level and their impacts on electoral politics, but I'm more interested in the impacts of this conservative coalition on public sector labor law, government regulation of the employment relationship, and welfare programs. That's an area I've worked that much on thus far. And my point, like Acker and Pearson's, is that the conservative movement proposes some ideas, of course, we know them well, but it's also based on increasingly deep-rooted organizations, institutions, some of which I'll mention later on, that technically have very little to do with labor relations, but have been increasingly influential in the gathering offensive against public sector workers. So Marco mentioned earlier a pro-corporate neoliberal reform agenda that's very effective in the American case as compared to others. And what I'll do here, I'll summarize a couple of key points that I make in the second part of the paper. It's entitled Neoliberalism, What's in a Name? And it's really on the domestic aspects of the right-wing counter-revolution under Reagan, Clinton, into the new century until the crisis of 2007. And the key point here is that neoliberalism, as it consolidated around the Austrian school, the Chicago school, libertarians, the religious right, and how when it attached itself to then the Tea Party, the alt-right, very much changed and took a American flavor. That I would summarize the following way. The primary objective of the conservative movement in the US and the neoliberal ideas that they push forward is turning back the New Deal and the remnants of New Deal programs. I'm following here Kimberly Phillips Fine, a historian of the conservative movement. And back in the 70s, the idea was to shift the burdens of the crisis of the 70s onto American workers, be they from the ranks of the working poor or the middle class, and enrich the wealthiest through a form of oligarchic redistribution, as Wolfgang Streich would call this. So the broad neoliberal or conservative movement in the US aims at destroying the New Deal, and as Phillips Fine has said, for them the New Deal and the labor movement itself is an excess of democracy. She says that the organization of the working class into labor unions to conservatives is an excess of democracy, and this would explain the rise of the welfare state, which is a really bad thing from the point of view of conservatives, and for them it's the perversion of fundamental market principles, and that explains the series of measures that I'm outlining in the second part. So there I deal with the Volcker shock, first off, like the shift from neoliberalism to monetarism, and the following cold bath from 79 to 82, the deep recession of these years, which was really a moment when public sectors moved from the offensive to really the defensive. And austerity measures were very deep during those years. I'll take a little sip on that. It's very difficult to really give the essence of the narrative here. I'll have to do some vignettes like Marco and my colleague before. I'm following here Judith Stein, an economic historian who's shown that at the epoch of the Volcker shock, there were multiple signs in the polity of the growing power of financial interests, even before Reagan came to power. That made sure that the second oil shock in '79 was accompanied by deep austerity measures that I've been trying to document in this paper. This also created the elevated oil prices, high interest rates, and stagnation triggered the fiscal crisis of the state, late 70s and early 80s, that prepared the ground for the advancing ideas of the new right, which were basically put into action with the plutocratic tax cuts that Reagan pushed. We mentioned the mandate for leadership, the Heritage Foundation, which was very much the plan for the first mandate of Reagan. So these tax cuts heavily targeted towards the richest and the corporations basically dug the biggest deficit in post-World War II history in the US. So this deficit was in large part the effect of slower growth and then these tax cuts and lower tax revenues. The 90s were a time of bringing down deficits in the late 90s, but in the US, as I show, this was already done through retrenchment of social protection under the Clinton administration, late 90s, when, especially after the tax Turks, Newt Gingrich and the deficit hawks, we know, took power of Congress and then basically forced the Clinton administration in the right corner. After that, we had multiple initiatives to end welfare as we know it. This was Clinton's phrase. So welfare reform started under the impetus of deficit reduction, late 90s, early 21st century. By the late 90s, a country like the US had surpluses, but this didn't last long. Other plutocratic tax cuts occurred under Bush Jr., and then there were wars of choice in Afghanistan, for instance, and Iraq. We once again had ballooning deficits even before the 2007-2008 crisis. Meanwhile, we had what I've described. There's a long section in the paper that could be cut. Several, actually. There's a part of the paper that describes how neoliberal deregulation created money manager capitalism that was unstable and collapsed, and maybe I could cut 15 pages there in the middle, like I just did. Well, I promise. And basically what I'm doing in the last bit of the paper, and I'll be quick on that, I'm just going to give you a feel of what's in there. We had a bubble-driven growth pattern that was unsustainable, led to the Great Recession and Great Credit Crunch of 2007 and 8. And after that, what we've seen is austerity as again rolled out, but as part of this again broader neoliberal program. So I've summarized the neoliberal programs in the year of Reagan, and I repeat the same kind of planks under the current administrations. And what I tried to show is that basically any hope of a New Deal died in 2010 when Tea Party-driven Republican caucus won the midterm elections and took control of Congress. Then they blocked any other attempts at fiscal stimulus in the US. The key actors here were Americans for Tax Reform, the Club for Growth, the Koch Network, basically organizations that seem to be outside of the realm of public sector labor relations, but that mobilized in order to push austerity. That was then the legitimation for attacks on public workers' rights. And that led to 2,545 statutes in the US, across the US, labor bills that have been submitted between 2007 and 2014. Magic Wade, I invite you to read her paper, even though she criticizes me. In the last issue of Labor Studies journal, Magic Wade has done kind of a survey of these bills justified by austerity, these attacks on public workers' rights. And she says basically that I underestimated the wave of anti-public sector collective bargaining statutes. And she does that's based on a PhD dissertation, and it's a very thorough analysis of basically how the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, basically organized what we call model statutes. So I'm finishing on that. Model statutes are being prepared by think tanks and corporate interests. They are then offered in return for funding to politicians who then apply them in state houses. So wait in a couple of weeks if the results of the midterm elections are not as dire for the Conservatives as we think they might be. We could see another instance of large-scale broad attacks on public sector workers if some of these state houses are kept in Republican control and Republican governorships. So I'll finish on that. I thought I was going to bomb it even more than that, but I'll keep time for questions. Thank you.